Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I'm Managing Editor Cole Altom. I'm your host today. Joining me today is Director of Analysis Jacob Shapiro. Hello, Jacob.
Hello, Cole. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you for asking. And two other all-star analysts, Phillip Orchard and Ryan Bridges.
What up?
Hello.
Okay, let's just get right into it. The big thing this week, obviously, that everybody's been talking about is Brexit. It's just a huge mess. The British Parliament had, I think, 7 or 8 different options for Brexit that they could have voted yes on, and they voted no on every single one of them. I won't pretend to understand it all, but Ryan, you are really, really smart on this sort of thing. So why don't you start us off, catch us up on Brexit. What happened during this very dumb week?
Oh, yeah, this very dumb week. Basically, what happened is that Parliament got frustrated with the government spending almost 2.5 years and making very little progress. And MPs decided to try to take over the process. Their first step was to take over the agenda for 2 days on Wednesday and also on Monday of next week. They will do some of these votes, and they're non-binding votes. They're not going to shape government policy in any way. They are essentially trying to show the government that they can find a majority for something that the government can shift to and hopefully get Brexit moving and get it passed. As you said, they failed miserably. No, not miserably. They failed at everything. So they held votes. All of the votes failed. A couple of them were pretty close. One that is ostensibly the policy of the opposition Labour Party is for there to be a permanent customs union in the future with the European Union. This would just essentially remove some frictions to trade between them. That one very nearly passed. It failed by, I believe, 8 votes. And another one that failed narrowly by maybe 24 votes was to, before the agreement can be ratified, there would be another public referendum on it. I don't know exactly what the options would be. I don't even think that they were spelled out in the motion. So I don't know if it would be a choice between the deal or remaining in the EU or the deal and versus keep negotiating. But that one failed narrowly too. And so a lot of observers think that if the government were to shift to targeting a permanent customs union and agree to hold another referendum at the end of it, they might be able to get the deal through. Go for it.
Ryan, let me ask you a little bit more about trade. You published a piece today on our site and had a really interesting line I like. I think because throughout a lot of places in the media, this is kind of painted as a democracy versus non-democracy type of issue or a partisan issue, and it really stopped being that a long time ago. In your piece, I'm quoting here, "The key to unlocking a border agreement," this is referring to the Irish border question, "lies in the final trade relationship. The problem is that trade is the one area where the EU and Europe are synonymous. There is no way to sever links with one and not the other." Can you talk a little bit about the trade versus political relationship and kind of the problems that creates?
Yeah, well, one thing I would say is I do think that it's true, obviously, that there's still partisanship. There's still leavers and remainers in the European Union. That is still a real debate. But, something that's kind of been overlooked is that there was a majority of the public that voted to leave. And there was a huge majority of Parliament that voted to start the process of leaving. There is a majority for leaving. Both of the major parties are in support of leaving. Obviously, there's some partisan politics breaking down there. The opposition is reluctant to help the Conservative Party get this deal through. But it's not exactly true to say, as some people have said, that the reason that there's all this deadlock is because Remainer MPs are holding things up. There is a majority for leaving. But what's happened is that there's no majority for what leaving looks like. That's the hard part. That's the part that no one's been able to agree on, is how are they going to leave? And the two biggest obstacles are the Irish border and, very much related to that, the trade relationship. And when it comes, when you look at the European Union and you look at the different aspects of the relationship that the United Kingdom could have with it. When it comes to like foreign policy, security policy, defense, in those respects, the European Union is not that closely integrated yet. It's still very much a work in progress. It's easy for an outside country, especially a enormously significant one like the United Kingdom, to participate in those areas. It's easy for it to participate, I don't know, in different political areas, and banking, of course, because it's such a huge London's a huge financial center. But when it comes to trade, that is the EU's bread and butter, and it is first and foremost a free trade area, and that is where they are inextricably linked. You can't boss the EU around when it comes to trade. The EU is in charge, and they're very powerful. It's the second largest economy in the world, and so it's very hard to. I'm rambling, but you got my point.
Jacob, you've written a lot about the Irish border and some of these issues as well. Do you want to jump in here?
Man, I don't know. I mean, I feel like Ryan, do you think that there's going to be a deal in the end? Because I look at this and I still think, even with all the melodrama, it's still in the best interest of both sides to get a deal. And if they continue doing this like song and dance where they're going to take things into the House of Commons and vote against it, I still feel like then the EU is going to give them an extension, and we're going to have like another year of reporting on breathless meetings and summits and this, that, or the other thing. Like, do you actually think this is going to break?
That's the very, very stupid part of this is it's been 2.5 years and every single option is still on the table. I mean, that was the number one thing that the indicative votes that Parliament held a few days ago showed, is that they haven't really narrowed anything down. They have a deal, but even that deal is probably dead now after it's failed for the third time today. One thing that I have been thinking about is it's obviously it's true that it's in the European Union's interest to get a deal. France has become a very interesting case because the French are, I think, thinking more short term, and the French are, for various reasons, probably historical rivalry, and I think the French, probably more than any other European country, sees the UK's departure as an opportunity to make the European Union more French, especially more protectionist. If they have another liberal power like the UK out. And so the French, I think, are starting to really think that maybe no deal, maybe just cutting this off now wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Of course, like, one country cannot force the others to do anything. I mean, technically they could veto, they need unanimous approval for an extension, but the French are not going to be the one country that steps out of line and forces no deal in the rest of the EU. But it will be interesting to see if there's some French diplomacy to start changing minds and convincing other European powers that maybe this just end. At this point, it would not. I'm with you. I think that they're going to continue to delay. They, being the British, are going to continue delaying a decision for as long as they can, which there's really no limit. And I don't see a way out of it unless, one, the French are able to change their minds and just say, let's just get this over with. Or, even though the polls show that it wouldn't change anything, they hold another election, whether that's a general election or another referendum, which I know is a toxic idea and has all sorts of problems. But at this point, I feel like they need to just like reshuffle the deck, and that may be the only way out of it. If they can change the makeup of Parliament and maybe end up lucking into a majority that way.
Yeah, I think the other thing that is striking to me is just that going into these negotiations, it always sort of seemed like the UK was going to have an advantage because the UK was one country and the EU was going to be 27 countries. And how could you get, all the European Union on the same page, whereas the UK could pursue sort of one track, right, and negotiate its interests? And yes, the EU had all the economic heft and the trade heft, but there was no way it was going to harmonize its internal positions. And somehow throughout all this, the United Kingdom has managed to back itself into the corner where actually it's the one that's most divided about this. And part of that has to do, I think, with the House of Commons and the people are now deciding the manner of exit and not just the exit itself. Like, if you put a withdrawal agreement to the democratic vote of all of the European member states, and I mean like the population of the European member states or even the parliaments of the European member states, I wonder if you would see the same kind of chaos. the thing that the UK has done over and over here is it gives the referendum to the people. Now it wants to give power to the House of Commons to approve this, that, or the other thing. Every time it does that, it basically loses its ability to make any kind of decision based on a national interest, right? Like you're talking here about France, and you're thinking, well, France can think this, that, or the other thing about Brexit. We can't even talk about what the British want with Brexit because the British don't know what they want with Brexit. And that's like the whole problem.
Yeah, I completely agree. Obviously, other countries, if I don't know, the Denmark or something decided to leave the European Union, they wouldn't have the same sorts of political issues with a border, keeping a border open, but they would run into the same problems with the trade relationship, where if you want to have a free trade agreement and be able to form your own trade agreements with other countries, with non-EU countries, you then have to put up greater barriers to trade with the European Union, which will invariably be your most important trade partner. So I certainly think that it's true that once you start to put meat on the bones of this idea of leaving the European Union, it gets a lot more problematic.
I don't know, man. A Denmark exit could be really dramatic. You never really know how Greenland is going to swing, do you?
Yeah.
It'll swing all the way to China.
Yeah, it's coming firmly into the orbit of China's Belt and Road Initiative. That's actually probably as good a segue as any. Philip, you recently wrote about some of the outcomes of China's most recent National People's Congress, which is basically just like a rubber stamp meeting where they, as a matter of course, just kind of approve everything.
Yeah, but it is interesting because they what China announces, they usually do, at least in terms of like specific policy, and you can learn quite a bit about what's keeping them up at night through these sorts of things, and the sort of tone of the themes of even a rubber stamp legislature like this.
All right, so what did they decide this time?
Well, I wrote a piece about this week, and about basically the big focus is on banking reform, which is exciting. The big problem is that the private sector, which forms I think 80% of employment in China and a very large number of percent of their GDP. Basically, they're not getting bank loans. Companies are having a really hard time. Private firms are having a really hard time getting anyone to lend to them, so it's forcing them to go into these, like we call it, shadow banking channels, or to borrow from overseas banks, which means they're borrowing in dollars, which can be really expensive to pay back if the Chinese currency plummets. What's interesting about this and what I wrote about is basically like that this is the result of previous reforms. The stuff they rolled out at the NPC 2 years ago. Basically, in particular, is big crackdown they've had trying to stamp out shadow lending. And so it's a great case study in the unintended consequences and trade-offs of reform. And the way, because banking reform isn't the most exciting stuff to write about or the easiest to digest, the way I originally tried to frame it was this really tortured metaphor that mercifully the editors cut in the interest of preserving my reputation as a serious thinker, basically describing it as like driving the Titanic through, like, say, past Greenland at a really high speed, trying to veer right to dodge one iceberg, and without knowing how big it is, and then you have to overcorrect and veer left, and then you got another big problem, and you can't slow down in the sense that like China can't let their economy just slow down the way that like most economies would, because everyone on board will revolt and throw you overboard. So again, thankfully that did not end up on our website, but I thought it was pretty good.
Can't imagine why not, right?
I spent a long time on it. I was desperately trying to find some kind of metaphor, and I was like, cycling through all sorts of ones.
What you should have done, it's always easier to make a metaphor to explain the metaphor that explains the thing that you're trying to say.
Ooh,
that's like through the wormhole type shit. Sorry, what were we going to say, Ryan?
I was just going to say that I feel like iceberg slalom is a very apt metaphor.
I thought it was pretty good. I ran through a bunch of them. I was thinking of like, when you try to like cut your own hair and then you go too high on one side, so then you try to even it out by going a little higher on the other side, and then that's too high. So next thing you know, you've shaved your whole head. That didn't quite work. I was thinking of, I've often called it like high stakes whack-a-mole. They knock down one problem and another one just pops up. I'll try to get a better one next time. That can,
this is making too much sense right now.
But basically, I just ran through sort of the history of banking reform briefly, especially since 2008, which 2008, they lost all their exports, caused this big problem. So they flooded the system with credit, and then that led to inflation. So to tamp that down, they tightened monetary conditions, which led to the rise of shadow banking, which led to this, which led to that, yada, yada, yada. And the main point is that it just speaks to China's bigger picture problems, which is like they can't slow down the ship. They can't, because of their rigid system and their very, very minuscule tolerance for social unrest and social discontent. They can't allow for a cleansing liquidity crunch in the way that like most countries could. And because they're so worried about tightly holding on to control of everything, they lean very heavily on state-owned enterprises. So all the banks just want to lend to them because everyone knows that the state-owned enterprises that they'll be backed up by the government. And so that sort of those two things in particular have locked China into this pattern. So now they're rolling out all these big new initiatives. Some of them might work. You never know. They're really ambitious. A lot of, they kind of signals that they're trying to get to the problem this time at the root, but they're still trapped between these like really tight economic and political realities that don't give them a lot of room to maneuver.
So to what extent, and this is probably a pretty ignorant question, but to what extent do some of these banking policies and monetary policies intersect with trade war issues? I know they're sort of distinct and separate, but in China, nothing's really that distinct or separate when you talk about trade and economic and political policy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's one of the tricky things about both, I guess, governing China and also on our end, trying to understand what's going on is, everything's interconnected. The biggest problem is not the tariffs. We said that a lot and kind of explained that, tried to map that out a lot. The biggest problem is their internal debt and the broader global slowdown and all sorts of other things. The tariffs don't help, that's for sure. They are, and a lot of the pain that they're feeling is concentrated in their like coastal export powerhouse provinces like Guangdong. The ones where most of with these really wealthy these provinces that have become really wealthy by shipping tons of stuff to the United States. Those are historically those are the ones that China has most feared breaking away during times of decentralization or unrest, and so that kind of adds an extra layer of anxiety in Beijing. The trade war, it doesn't help, and a lot of, I guess you could say in a way it does help, because if they could liberalize their economy to really get at the root of this problem, they would need to have a much more open and dynamic banking system with lots of foreign investment and so forth. And a lot of what they need to do to fix that specific problem sort of aligns neatly with the demands being made by the United States. And so, and there are a lot of reformers in China who want to see this stuff happen and think it needs to happen. And so they're kind of, in a small way, kind of glad that the trade wars happen in order to give Beijing an excuse to do what's long been needed to be done. That said, the reformers aren't the ones who are concerned about holding the country together in the way that Xi Jinping is, and the people who are worried about China splitting apart at its seams if it liberalizes too much too fast are the ones who are calling the shots of the trade war, and they're the ones who are going to balk at any kind of sweeping concessions that give the U.S. everything it wants.
Yeah, well, he's setting himself up to be emperor for life, so he doesn't want it to deteriorate under his watch, I suppose. Sticking with China for a moment, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, is going to visit China here pretty soon. Her profile has risen, obviously, lately in light of the mosque shootings, but we're not really going to get into that so much. But she is more high profile than many, I think, in that region kind of tend to be. Why is she going to China, Jacob? What's she doing there? Do they expect to sign anything of import? What's happening here?
New Zealand's already got an MOU on Belt and Road, so hopefully we can be spared the hysteria about New Zealand flipping. No, I just thought it was interesting because New Zealand and China have been having some issues because New Zealand has been taking a more anti-China posture, I think we can call it that, in recent months. They've even been buying some new military equipment, and they've been pretty strong on the Huawei 5G ban and all this other stuff. And then there was a cancellation of a visit at one point that was a big insult. So, no, I just thought, A, a shout out to our New Zealand listeners because, there are so many of them. And B, I just thought it was interesting that she's going to talk to Xi right now, especially in the context of all the things that are happening between China and Canada, China and the United States, the whole gamut.
How much does China care about the South Pacific generally?
I would imagine that China cares about the South Pacific in the context of sort of if China is able to achieve some of its goals in the first island chain or in the South China Sea, then the South Pacific actually becomes important. And then sort of a second order thing is that the more you can weaken the U.S. alliance structure, the better it is for China in the long term. So I don't think it's the type of thing where the South Pacific is going to become the next South China Sea or by any means, but China is certainly looking for relationships in that part of the world that it can parlay into political influence something like 50 or 100 years down the road, because that's the time scale at which Chinese policy thinkers think about things, whereas U.S. foreign policy thinkers can't even think next week. So,
yeah, China sometimes does have that luxury of thinking in the very, very big picture. Other countries not so fortunate. They have to deal with immediate issues. One such country is Turkey. Jacob, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about Turkey. They're having some currency problems at the moment. Can you explain that to our listeners?
I just thought we would put it on people's radar because that's also happening this weekend. They're having big municipal elections. And for the first time, well, I hesitate to read too much into polls at any point now, but it looks at least like Erdogan's party is facing some weakness in the campaign that's coming up. And the Turkish lira has gone crazy again. And if you go back and look at some of our writing and analysis from 6 months ago, all the problems that were in the Turkish economy when the lira first took a nosedive are still there. They're still overexposed to US dollar denominated debt. They still need lots of foreign investment. And you still have a government that has basically used a version of crony capitalism to solidify its power. And it wants to keep the economy humming as much as it can. And it's basically running out of steam. And at a certain point, the Turkish economy is going to have to go through some problems. And the government is at least behaving like a government that doesn't think there's a whole lot of political resilience in the system right now. And you think about the attempted coup, I should say, and all the other things that have been happening in Turkey in recent years, it's hard not to agree with them.
Well, depending on when this podcast publishes, we either have recently published a story on Turkey, or will soon publish a story on Turkey, and that's by Xander Snyder, who couldn't make it to the podcast today. But if you want to hear more about it, then definitely check out our website for that. Remember, you can always go to Geopolitical Futures, sign up for a subscription, sign up to our free list. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, all these good things. That's about it for us today. Thanks very much for taking the time to join us. I'm Cole, Jacob, Phillip, Ryan. Thank you very much. We'll talk to y'all next time.